Okay, we are now live. Live. Oops.
Hello and welcome to this seventh session in the new Well-Versed programme related to Stanza Poetry Festival 2022. This is our final session of our 2022 series events for Well-Versed, which aims to which involves myself in conversation with festival poets, aiming to explore in a bit more detail and a bit more depth, really, the way in which various poets have engaged with the festival theme, which on this occasion has been the role of narrative and stories in poetry. For this seventh session of this year's programme, and the final one actually before we take a bit of a break for the summer, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Nidhi Zak. On her website, Nidhi describes herself in a fascinating kind of combination of three ways: as a poet, as a pacifist, and as a fabulist. In 2021, her first collection was published with Faber and Faber, Auguries of a Minor God, which was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize and the John Pollard Foundation International Poetry Prize. It was also chosen as a Poetry Book Society recommendation, a National Poetry Day UK recommendation, a Shakespeare & Co Year of Reading Selection, and a Book of the Year by both the Irish Times and the Irish Independent. I was interested to have Nidhi along for one of these conversations, though, not only for this fabulous first collection, but also for the range of ways in which her work actually engages with the theme, and the interesting way in which there's a crossover, I suppose, between Nidhi's travels, her experiences, the cultural influences, and how these find expression in storytelling or her choice of content or form or approach to storytelling in her work. Over the course of the interview, I'm going to kind of engage with various different elements of Nidhi's work, which quite often finds realization in much more of a sort of public capacity rather than just on the page. But before I go on any longer, I would like to, as has happened in all these sessions, I would like to welcome Nidhi and invite her to read us a poem. We'll then have a bit of conversation, and then we'll finish in about 25 minutes or so with a concluding poem. So with no further ado, Nidhi, can I welcome you to this well-versed session for Stanza 2022?
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thanks for having me. It's really lovely to be here. It's lovely to be part of the festival as well, and to get to talk to so many interesting poets working with narrative in their work. So yeah, delighted to be here. And I was going to read one of my poems because, just to kick off the conversation. So this is from it's the second poem in the collection. Because nothing is like anything else. An approximation will always break down when you need it most. Because nothing is as soft as a horse's muzzle at the curve above quiet punctuations of hair, thin, pointed teeth, guarding tenderness. Because I had just been that morning at my college graduation, looking gorgeous in that dress, where the speaker urged, I hope you will be vulnerable with each other, that you will be open to giving and receiving vulnerability. Because he touched me without asking, saying you are like nothing I have ever seen before. Like how I am touching this horse, feeling it's like nothing else before us. Two silken manes, two hurt mouths. I am so gentle with you between my hands, but tell me, strike my face, pull away. Do you not want me to? Blow slow into the open black tunnel of flared nostril, wet, dark, animal breathing back. That's how they kissed. The passing stable hand spoke in my direction, and I believed him. I believed, not because it was true, but because I wanted to.
Thank you, Nidhi. That's a fantastic start to this evening session. It was actually one of my favourite poems in the collection, so I'm delighted to actually hear you read it and to actually bring it off the page and bring it to life. I might return to that poem later on, but I'm going to start off with a very general question, a version of which I've asked every poet who I've interviewed as part of this well-versed series, which is really, what role do you feel that narrative and stories play in your work, and what do you feel they offer a poet? So I suppose it's a specific questions in terms of your own approach, and what do you feel that narrative actually offers? Why do you engage with it? Why do you draw on it? Is it impossible not to?
I think for me, so some of the earliest poems that I would have read would have been epic poems. So like in a lot of Greek classical tradition, the Indian tradition also has narrative poems that would be sort of long epics like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And they'd often be sort of like stories within stories, you know, nested or framed stories that they would use to tell, sort of like the Sherazade as well, and the, you know, 1001 tales. And so it kind of goes back for me to childhood, to those stories that were told to me when I was sort of bedtime stories, I guess you would call them. But I think the essence of those poems was that I was trying to convey a message. So it wasn't solely about emotion. It was also about the culture and the society in which you were, and that has carried on for me, I think, through my life as well. Trying to use poetry to gesture at something, you know, to make something happen in the world, which is important to me, and also the fact that poetry it's such an oral tradition, you know, it's kind of how it came to be, and that for me, especially when I'm reading poetry or when I'm performing poetry, there's a sort of magic that happens between the storyteller, and then the listener, because there's a sort of imaginative contract between you, so it enhances what is on the page, which doesn't happen when you're solely just reading it as sort of a static text. So narrative would be really important to me, I think, in terms of inviting the reader along with you, because it's sort of like a road for me, which then has, street lights and markings and milestones. You can see where you're going. You kind of have a direction, something to guide you along, something to situate you within time and space, which otherwise would require a bit of work, maybe. Which isn't always easy in poetry, I suppose. The more abstract.
Yeah, sure. There's so much in the answer, and which I'm going to revisit, I suppose, at various times. And one sense, so when you, in your initial sort of part of your answer there, you talked about the importance of storytelling, of narrative in the epic tradition, and different cultural traditions, different versions of kind of classical texts. And I think it's very interesting. So tell me if I'm getting the sequence wrong, but you were born in India and grew up in the Middle East and then moved to North America, and you're now in Ireland. Is that a rough synopsis
it's a good approximation? Yeah. A few stops along the way, but
have you found that kind of trajectory has encouraged or enabled you, or to kind of dip into different kind of historical traditions or epic traditions or different versions of classics, or in terms of your points of reference, I suppose?
Yeah, so definitely I think mythology has been a doorway for me to enter different cultures, because the stories are quite universal, even if the characters change and the time changes. The stories are usually quite universal, so it's easier for me to feel like I belong to a certain tradition or a certain culture through those older stories, and also through the similarities in the languages themselves, because I think a lot of those Indo-European languages would sort of derive from the same initial proto-language. So that's been really interesting for me, because I did study Sanskrit and Latin and all the languages, to see those resonances even with Irish or Celtic languages is really interesting. So it's definitely been a way that I've sort of situated myself within a certain tradition, especially one that has been foreign to me. And then also I find that it's sometimes easier to engage with other people as well within that tradition, because you're not really stepping on anyone's toes, because folklore and myth sort of belongs to everyone, as opposed to the maybe more contemporary or political events that happen.
Is there a risk, or has anyone ever said to you, so I think with myth, it's always this case of rewriting and finding a contemporary context, and it's like changing the version of the myth. I suppose within that there might be potential people to go, no, wait, hang on, you're changing the story too much. That's not what it meant. Have you ever been challenged in that way, or?
I don't think personally. I think it's sort of trendy now to be contemporizing a myth. But I would be myself kind of very maybe wedded to the classical version of a tale. So I try not to interpret it too much, because I feel like the message within those myths are actually important, and if it's changed too much, then it risks sort of losing that original essence. So I don't usually mess with a myth too much, but it does spark lots of things for me. And so a lot of the poems would have sort of been derived from myths, maybe not explicitly, but they'll always have an element. And so in the longer poems that I have at the end of the book, there's a myth of horses, which draws on different sort of myths of the symbol of the horse in different traditions. And kind of take something from them. So I do, like, I use it a lot. I draw on it a lot, even if it isn't conscious. I think subconsciously there is something underneath that kind of runs
Yeah.
stories that I run.
When I read A Myth of Horses, I kind of picked up on a suggestion within it, and I might have been, it might not have been how you had sort of intended the metaphor, but the idea that you weren't just talking about the myths of horses, but this possibility that there are only kind of 5 myths or 5 basic kind of stories, which reminded me of the sort of Christopher Booker argument, there are only 7 basic plots, that kind of idea. Do you think that, do you have sympathy with that kind of view? Do you think there are just 5 basic myths and stories?
I think that was probably a bit of a contentious view, but I do think that
we like contentious.
I do think you can't really tell a new story. I think you can tell stories in different ways. So you can tell stories in new ways, but I don't think you can tell a new story, because I think that the form of the story is quite limiting in terms of what it can do. And for me, the form of language is also incredibly limiting, especially in poetry. So there's only so much you can do, and there is a point where language fails you, and continues to fail you as a writer. And so for me, the myth is sort of an acknowledgement of that failure, but that within that there are certain things that we can achieve, but it can only go so far. And that's where silence becomes really important for me then. So within my work, there's a lot of space, like there'll be a lot of white space, there'll be a lot of kind of gaps, and it can be quite unsettling, I think, for a reader, because there's this sort of disjoint in it. But I feel like that's what language does for us, like it takes you on this boat of communication, but only takes you so far, and then you kind of have to swim the rest of the way on your own strength, which is difficult, and also risks being kind of misunderstood a lot. So I play with that a lot in poetry as well, that failure of language, that inability to really empathize with another person's position, because you are limited by this vehicle, which is interesting, because it is the thing that takes you there, but only takes you to the door, and then you have to go the rest of the way yourself. So yeah, there is that.
You've also got poems in which I think actually the final poem you're going to read is maybe a history in stone, but a number of poems where you have actually kind of stroked out words, and you get this sense of then the line having almost 2 potential meanings. So for example, in a history of stone, just for those people who aren't familiar with Nidhi's work, it could be read as, when did we make up our minds to break from this asylum? But with the deletion, it becomes, when did we make our break from this asylum? So you got those two kind of different versions of it, which I felt actually was quite interesting, in the sense of, in any one story, there are lots of other potential stories, but I wonder whether actually more of what you were gesturing at was a sense of language failing you and being unreliable, or was it a combination of those two?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. So that particular poem is about a relationship sort of breaking down, and it's the last kind of final stages of that. And it brought up for me a lot of how, when we speak to someone else, particularly someone who we're close to, we think that they're understanding where we're coming from and what we're saying. And it's rarely the case. And it's interesting to me, because I'll say something and I'll think that the other person is interpreting it in exactly the same way that I would interpret it, which is such a strange assumption, because they're a totally different person. But still, somewhere in our minds, there's this, everybody comprehends the world in the same way that I comprehend the world, right? And I think that's what's so precious about poetry for me, is you read a poem and you read it a completely different way from someone else, and you take something else away. And
it's almost like an emphasized kind of performance of that dynamic, isn't it? It's like,
like it becomes more about the reader than the actual poem, or the intent of the writer, whatever it might be. And that's really interesting to me, because it's like, do we ever really understand each other then, or are we just kind of seeing ourselves mirrored in whoever is in front of us? And then it kind of depends on how clear that the mirror is, you know, how kind of how much you can see inside the other mirror. So that's kind of what I was playing with there as well, is just how much of what I say is the way it is because I say it is that way, you know, as opposed to like it might be totally different for someone else who's experiencing it. Yeah, which is humbling, and also really challenging as someone who deals in language. Is, you know, how can you actually approximate that?
How does this work? So in your kind of like introductory kind of response, you talked about or you kind of alluded to the sort of the idea of a message within a poem and actually engaging with the world and what's going on. And I was really interested to read in your website about your work as a global peace ambassador with the Institute for Economics and Peace. I was wondering, you know, this sense of language kind of failing us, how does that affect the dynamic when you're trying to say something meaningful or engage with something meaningful? Can poetry advocate for a different type of world, or does language fall down, or should poetry do that? What are your kind of, where do you sit in those kind of questions?
It's a cool question, because I used to work as a conflict mediator. So it was sort of, you would sit with two parties who had very opposing views on a situation and try to come to some sort of agreement with them. And many times it would be in places where I either didn't speak the language well enough to be able to do that myself. So there would be a translator and interpreter, and, you know, there would be many layers of kind of obfuscation. And it was a difficult subject anyway, you know, to do with people who agreed with each other. So it was even harder to do with people who don't agree with each other, and have very kind of opinionated stances on things. But I realized how much of it was about presence more than the message. So I think this is why I'm also drawn to poetry, is the performance aspect, or the public aspect of it, where it is shared in real time, in a live space, you know, as opposed to me reading it after the fact, or imbibing it kind of in the absence of the person who was transmitting it. And I think that's been really important to me to kind of get across, even with this collection. And also why that sort of wordplay and stuff comes in, because you can read it in different ways, and you should read it in different ways. You know, there isn't just one, like, my message is not the message kind of thing. But I do want to start a conversation, I suppose, around I think like our over-reliance on language. Particularly I felt it during the pandemic and during lockdown, where everything was so dependent on communication, you know, and usually written communication, sometimes oral communication. But so much is lost during that, because you can't read the language of the body at all, you know, and that's really what we are reading when we're reading someone else, is we're reading the body language. And if you didn't have the words, and if you couldn't understand the language, say, you would only have that to go on. So for me, growing up in places where a lot of times I didn't speak or understand the language, I really just went on the tone of people's voices, or kind of the expressions on their faces, or, you know, whether they looked agitated or whether they looked happy or whatever. So I think with trying to change the world, or sort of create some sort of transformation within a society, it's always a combination of both those things. So it's an idea, or it's a sort of philosophy or something, but then it's also how do we actually embody this, you know? And that's where poetry becomes really important for me, because you're breathing, you're feeling the words in your body. You're not just, and there's an emotional investment. It's not just, you know, that was a great story, I had a good time, I was entertained by that, or, you know, but it shifts something within you. I think a good poem shifts something within you, and you're not the same after it.
Yeah, and you play around a lot with form. So in particular, thinking about the long narrative sequence, the end is for Arabs. It's not only an ABCDRE, it also seems to be based in the Fibonacci sequence in terms of kind of each section kind of growing. And there are other poems where you draw on prose poetry, there's open form poetry, there's a wide range of kind of approaches. Is there a sense of trying to, I just wondered when you were speaking there, whether there's a sense of actually an embodiment within that kind of, within that formal kind of exploration, is that, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this. Is there a sense in which that is trying to gather up and achieve some of this kind of like physical sense of bodily communication? Or am I off on a totally wrong track here?
No. I think that's where the auguries actually comes into the book. Is so originally they would sort of read the flight of the birds and they would kind of divine what was going to happen on the basis of that. And with this book as well, I wanted it to be, you know how when I was little, I had these like choose your own adventure books.
Yeah,
you could read and then they'd be like, if you want this to happen, go to page 64. And if you want this to happen, go to page 92. And it was a little bit like that for me, where it was like, you get to choose how you want to read this and how you want to experience this, you know. So I think with the formal sort of experimentation, a lot of it was also that was like, I'm not gonna be like this guide saying you read from left to right and, you know, up to down and the usual way that you do it, but you could read it any way you wanted and you could take what you needed from it, which for me is important more than me saying this is how I wrote it and this is how you should experience it, you know, because I'm just, again, one person and one reader, but people take what they need from it, which is more important than my message.
Okay, I've got one last question, because I think I said I was going to ask about it in my kind of tweets and everything today, but you're also, so in your self-description you describe yourself as a poet, a pacifist and a fabulist. What is fabulism for you? What interests you about it? What's exciting about it? Is it a cultural thing? Is it, you tell me.
I think fables, for me at least, are like the epitome of good writing. Like, to write a good fable is extremely hard because it has this kind of moralistic aspect to it, you know, where you're teaching someone something at the end. But it's also like a really condensed and kind of succinct version of basically like a life, you know, and the trajectory of a life. And so I think one of my writing goals is to write a good fable, which is why I'm interested in fabulism, but I'm also interested in moving away slightly from the idea of a very sort of kind of literary realism, you know, this sort of like, it's a bit of a, it closes off to magic a little bit, you know. It's sort of like the world is very predictable and everything that happens is explainable, you know. There isn't room for a chink of madness, or, you know,
it limits possibilities, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I wanted to really open that up and say, because like there are magical moments happening everywhere all the time, you know, but we don't really convey it like that, and so people just write it off as though maybe it was a weird thing that happened, maybe it was something supernatural or paranormal, or, you know, something that doesn't fit in the frame of reality. So I think what I want to do with the fabulism is to kind of extend that outwards and say it isn't always the way that we see it and kind of make sense of it, you know. And again, it comes back to language. It's like we only have the words to describe what we know, but we don't have the words to describe what we don't know. So how do you actually do that when you have an experience that you can't articulate because you don't have the language for it? What do you do with that, you know? And I think the only way that you can express it then is through another form, like painting or dance or something that doesn't have that constraint around it in some way. So Yeah, it's one of my it was on my bucket list to write a paper.
Oh, brilliant. I'm afraid, like, I feel like we could chat for ages, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So, and I don't want to run out of time for your last poem. So, before we actually do that, we'll probably just end with Nidhi's poem. So I'm just going to say a huge thank you to Nidhi Zak for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. Nidhi's actually in Oman at the moment, and we were a bit worried that the thunderstorms might interfere with the reception, but we seem to have made it to the end. So that's absolutely fabulous. Well Versed is now taking a break over the summer, so there's certainly not going to be a session in August and probably not in September either. But I'm thrilled to say that we have managed to secure funding from Old Possum's Practical Trust, which means that we will be able to continue the programme next year, which will probably kick off in either late September or October, and will involve poets who are featuring in our 2023 festival, the theme of which will be revealed very soon. But anyway, enough spiel from me. Nidhi, do you want to read us out with your final poem?
Yeah, I love that name, the Old Possum.
I know, it's great, isn't it?
That's great. Okay, this is a history in stone. It's sort of like a prose poem with a break in the middle. So, used to be madness was considered a stone, you say, studying that Bosch painting at the Prado. When we reach the hotel again, you will look it up on ArtNet. Consider buying it, because you are the sort of person who still invests in things that you appreciate. Used to be madness was when you couldn't tell where you end and I begin. When did we make up our minds to break from this asylum? Were we not committed? Madrid, a flame in a smother of summer. Outside, hot stones, people dining al fresco splashed across the walls of this claustrophobic city. Retiro Park, properly pretentious, everywhere coats of arms, regalia, red seals like the one they'll emboss on our official split apart. But that is later. Today, we have not thought to speak the word, yet divorce still breathes between us. Be still baby in our bed. Wander hand in hand into this past with me. Perhaps we won't get hit by what we didn't see coming. We were beautiful together. In the bar across the lobby, you sliding beside me. Restless legs, all halves apples rallying in a sea of separation. Listen, you begin. Your voice a taut, strong pitch. I can feel the conversation about to surge. Reach for the table, steady now. We stroll these lines around ourselves and all we used to be. So, dime mi amor, is it over? Is it ours? The flailing thing that yawns, that warns. Come no closer, love, my madness. Stone-hearted lover. Thanks very much, Vicky.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening for our 7th session of Well Versed.